This is Paul Johnson with the New Frontiers. Today, our panel is going to have an exciting talk about what's happening with the creation of a third party in the United States. When Elon Musk decides that he's going to get involved and form what's called the American Party, you can bet it's going to be an issue. He's deeply concerned about what we saw with the big, beautiful bill, as well I believe he should be. Now, as a disclosure, I have been deeply involved in the open primary issue around the country, trying to ensure that independent voters and voters unaffiliated with the two parties, which now make up almost 40%, have an equal opportunity to participate. I will also tell you, I am actively engaged in the formation of a third party, so I have a bias in this, and you'll hear it throughout the show. But the reality is we have some big problems in our country. Energy needs and the ability to fix our water problems, the ability to balance our budget. But instead of talking about the classroom, we seem to spend all of our time talking about the bathroom. The reality is, for us to fix these issues, we're going to have to actively become engaged. I just wrote a book that's called What's Right with America. And in that book, while we talk about many, many reasons to be optimistic about America, we talk about two big challenges that we're going to have to confront if we're going to be successful. The first one is our budget deficits. And the second issue is that we need to make certain that we learn how to be nice to one another. We learn how to treat one another better. Now, I'm just an ordinary, optimistic American who still believes that the United States is a great cause for good. If you like what it is that we're talking about, press that subscribe button for me. Let's get the show going.
Destiny. Destiny. You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. 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 You and I have a rendezvous with destiny.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
All right, I'd like to welcome my panel back today, and we are going to focus on the idea of a third party in American politics. But before we do, let's just go around the horn here and say hi to everybody. Elliot, I believe that you are right now in California. How you doing?
I am.
What's it like there? What's the weather?
Weather today, the high was 71, so it worked.
That sucks. The high here.
Yeah, I know it's terrible. It's been great. It's a nice place if you can go back to Phoenix after the summer.
Yeah, I think the temperature here with the wind chill factor was 114 or something like that.
Wind chill.
All right, Henry, how you doing? You've been in New Zealand and Australia. How was the weather there?
The weather in Australia was actually really nice. There were some big storms come through, but in both cases we missed them, and was beautiful. I mean, it was probably in the 80s, so we had a nice time, sunny weather. And Sydney is a beautiful city. The mountains of Victoria, Australia, are beautiful. We took the kids on a ski lift ride. Not skiing, but took them up a ski lift to see snow, which as Arizonans was completely new to them. So that was pretty fun.
Yeah, it's what a beautiful countries, but the weather was pretty good, so that's nice. And then you had to have a 1-year-old on an airplane for 13 hours. How was that?
Yeah, I can't recommend it. I can't recommend it to anyone. I think it's one of those things that you do and then you just pretend like it never happened. Just put it in the memory hole, pretend like it never happened.
Yeah, I had a 4-year-old, and I actually had 6 kids on a way to Montana with me last week. And one thing that you have to learn to do is just to become obtuse to how angry everybody else is around you while your kids are screaming and yelling and upset.
Because there's nothing you can do about it anyway.
That's right. So you just kind of sit there and know that everybody's looking at you with evil eyes, but what the heck? All right. So today, by the way, we also have Bob Robb, who's going to try to come in a little bit later, but he's having some reception problems. We were just talking about this before the show. I was up in Alaska, and one of the things that was amazing, we're certainly going to talk about Elon Musk today and what he's doing with this third party, but I had his Starlink system up in Alaska. We were in the middle of nowhere. We were able to hook this thing up and to get literally to 5Gs where we had 5 or 6 people, all of us on some type of video content, doing different things. The only thing we were limited by was the battery, and I think the total cost per month on that system was like $160 a month. But I got done using that system, and I go back to this. This is an amazing human being. You can dislike him or like him in politics, but in terms of his ability to create and innovate, he is a special human being.
Yeah, I mean, he is the Thomas Edison of the 21st century. By the time the dust settles, he might eclipse Thomas Edison. It's astonishing what he's already done, and some of the things he's thinking about just seem so far-fetched. But I wouldn't bet against him. And he's and to those of you who don't like him because of his politics, I tell you to get a life. This guy is doing more for humanity than most people could even dream about in 10 lifetimes.
Yeah. And I agree. I think he is an amazing human being. Well, let's talk about his idea on a third party. And again, as a disclosure, I will admit I'm a supporter of a third party. But I'm a supporter of a third party because we were attempting to try to get an open primary done to try to open the system up more so that there would be greater competition. And we saw just huge opposition from the two political parties. In Arizona, our governor worked on what seemed like kind of a secret plan to raise a lot of money to go out and spend against it and to get her interest groups that were opposed to it. She didn't want to look like she was opposing the independents, but she was. But she was no different or worse than people on the right. They both tend to hate open primaries. I've become convinced the only way to get to real competition is going to be to have some type of political party that begins to advance those types of reforms. And we can talk about those reforms in a moment. But what I'm fascinated by with Elon Musk, and I do think he's right on this point, I'm not sure with what's happening with the federal budget that there's any other way to deal with the deficit unless these two parties end up with some type of challenge, some type of competition. We end up having this budget deficit, this big, beautiful bill that passed that created a budget deficit that's going to be about $5 trillion over a 10-year period of time. That's going to take us from $37 trillion to $60 trillion. But here's what I'm amazed by. The only opposition to that party comes from the Democratic Party. And what's their position? You didn't go deep enough in the hole. You need to spend more. And my answer to that is there's no group out there advocating for any type of fiscal sanity. Elliot, I want to start with you on that just because I know you've been talking about this issue for a long time.
Well, I think you got to take all these estimates with a grain of salt. Whether it's 5 billion or it's 3 billion or it's 7 billion remains to be seen. And
by the way, trillion, but
trillion.
Yes.
That shows you how old I am. But the basic concept is correct that we're spending too much, mainly too much in entitlements, given the danger in the world. And both parties, we were talking about Newsom a little before the show, how he tap dances through his actual history like it never happened. And that's what they're doing. They're tap dancing through their lack of fiscal sanity and screaming at each other. I just think that when we start talking about a third party, the time is ripe. Time is right for a third party. Not that I think a third party will win, but I am young enough to remember H. Ross Perot and the effect he had on both parties after the election of '92. And you just need somebody to put enough pressure on them to move them back to center. And I think that time is here. With Musk, I think that Musk is better off as an inventor than as a politician. That he has lost so much credibility with both Republicans and Democrats over what happened over the last 6 months. That he should not be the face of that third party. It's just me.
Yeah, it's amazing. I'm just worried about it as a Tesla driver, right? But as a Tesla driver, it used to be that all of the Republicans hated me when I would drive up in my Tesla. And then I went through this period where all the Democrats hated me when I would drive up in my Tesla. And then here lately, both sides hate you when you drive up in your Tesla. And it's like, okay, it's just a car. But Henry, you've been watching politics for a long time internationally, as well as the American system as well. Give me your thoughts about the potential of a third party and whether or not you see this issue of the budget deficit as maybe being something that pushes that issue over the top.
I think it's a really interesting idea. The time seems to be right for a third party in the United States if you look internationally, because there have been so many new parties spring up over the last 10 years or so in Western Europe. Even in Australia, there's been a new political party or group of politicians emerge in opposition to the two main political parties. The thing I'd say is that they have very different contexts. A lot of the things that you were talking about, Paul, that make it difficult to get a third party elected in the US are more tractable in other places. Like, for example, in Germany or in other countries, you've got proportional systems that allow smaller parties to get into the parliament with a lower share of votes. But even in the UK, which has a majoritarian system, like a winner-takes-all system, you've got a new party that's emerged under Nigel Farage called the Reform Party that's anti-immigration, that's got some similarities to Trump's agenda in the US. And the Reform Party seems to be having some real success. I mean, they haven't, kind of as you said about Perot, they haven't won a lot of seats, but they certainly damaged the Tories at the last election. So internationally, there's a lot of new parties springing up around all sorts of different issues. Whether a new party can spring up in the US is a different question. In some ways, I would say it already has, and it's the MAGA party under Donald Trump. It's the new Republican Party, because by taking immigration off of the shelf and saying, let's shake up this debate, Trump basically created a new political party, but he did it within the Republican Party. I guess it's possible that the same thing could happen with the deficit if things got really bad. I'd be interested to hear, Bob and Elliot, and your thoughts about the Tea Party and the extent to which the Tea Party was kind of about creating a new political party about the deficit. And that was about 10 or 15 years ago now. So I don't think it's impossible that a new party can spring up. I'm not sure whether it happens within one of the existing parties or outside of one of those parties, but we're just in one of those phases where a lot of preconceived ideas, when a lot of established wisdom doesn't seem to be working for a lot of people. There's a lot of frustration among voters. There seems to be a tolerance for more radical ideas. And so it could be that someone comes up with something, whether it's something we expect, like the deficit, or something we don't expect to be the issue that people seize upon. But there's absolutely the possibility that either a third-party candidate or a sort of a hostile takeover of one of the major parties occurs in the United States.
I think we certainly have reached the point in the country where we need some kind of reform which broadens the range of the kind of candidates who can reach a general election ballot. At this point in time, a center-right candidate has virtually no opportunity or chance to be a general election nominee. And that's even in a state like Arizona, where that's arguably the center of political gravity. We're not quite to that point. It is difficult for a center-left candidate to reach the general election ballot, but not impossible. And there's been center-left Democrats who have won contested primaries, for example, in Arizona and in some other states. So I think we very much need to have some kind of reform that broadens the range of candidates that realistically can offer their services to the electorate. I'm a little concerned about the consequences of a viable third party as that alternative. And that's because if you had a viable third party, you would have perpetual minority government if we retain the first past the post system of election, where the person who becomes president will win with 40% of the vote. So if we are going to go the third party route, and I think there's certainly enough people excluded from the two major parties at present to constitute a viable third party. I would like us to look at some kind of reform like the French presidential system, where you have multi-party system. But in the primary, the candidates of all of the various parties run against each other. And then you have a runoff of the two top vote getters. So you're ultimately presenting the voters with a binary choice, and the victor has majority support. I think an open primary system beneath the presidential level can provide many of the benefits without the detriments of a third-party system. It's hard, however, to see how that system works at the presidential level. At that level, you may need a third party to get a wider range of choices, or a multiple party system.
Yeah, in terms of a third party, my own personal opinion is what I want out of a third party is I want to try to create better competition and bring better people into the system who will run. But there's a big question that we'll have to answer, which is the question of, is it really being designed to win, or is it being designed to change the narrative that's going on in the debate? Now, if you get good enough candidates, you actually could win. But even without those candidates, if you can pull 8 to 10% of the vote, it begins to create a leverage for that third party that the other two parties will have to pay attention to, whatever those issues were. Elliot spoke a moment ago about the issue of Ross Perot. It's not hard to look back at Bill Clinton and to recognize that when he did all those charts talking about why we need to balance the budget, that was being partly driven because he'd run in a race that he wouldn't have won had it not been for Ross Perot talking about a balanced budget. He recognized it's important. Other things certainly happen as well. There's a great book written by Woodward who talks about the effect that the Greenspan had on Clinton by telling him, if you go out and you do this program that's going to try to talk about how it is that you can inflate the economy, I'm going to raise interest rates on you. And he began to recognize the connection that existed between the two. But for me, the big thing that a third party ought to be advocating for, how do you bring independence back into the system? And bringing independence back in the system, there's no better way to do it than an open primary. And I think a third party having that as part of its platform would be a good way to push for it. Bob, on this issue, though, of the fiscal budget, what is it that happens within the two parties that you can't get them to focusing on what I think many Americans see as being important, and certainly is important if your goal is to try to lower interest rates, which have a significant impact on most people in America? What is it about the two-party system that keeps us from being successful at that?
Well, the politics of fixing the finances of the federal government are difficult and instinctively politically unpopular. You either have to raise taxes, or you have to cut spending, or some combination of both. And at present, there is nothing before the American electorate which indicates to them or convinces them that those are necessary, tough decisions that have to be made. And we need competent problem-solving leadership in order to do it. At present, there is the political space for both sides to demagogue the issue. For the left to say we don't have a spending problem at all, we just need to make the rich pay more, even though that doesn't add up. And on the right, where you can say we're going to balance the budget, but we're not going to do anything to cut Social Security or Medicare now or infinitely into the future. And those numbers don't add up either. And until the federal government simply can't borrow the money at any reasonable rate to sustain the status quo, I don't think that either party will find it in their political self-interest to quit demagoguing the issue and address it honestly. And that's where I think a third party might serve a useful purpose, to at least start educating the American electorate as to the inevitable tough choices that are going to have to be made, and how making them sooner makes those decisions less harsh than making them later. But I just don't think that there's any political incentive at present for either of the two major political parties to deal with the issue honestly with the American people.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think if a third party had a major portion of its goal to try to help reform the issue of the budget deficit, we'd have a much higher likelihood of success. Again, simply because even if they can only pull off 8 to 10% of the vote, that becomes enough to create real competition. You know, we've if you look at Congress today, we have 435 seats in the House of Representatives. Of those 435, 35 of them, maybe at the most 60, are competitive. All the rest are determined in the primary. So if you go sell the issues in a primary that those voters want to hear, which make up about 8% of the voters, and by the way, most of those voters, or at least a majority of them, are what I call grievance voters, meaning they're mad about something. They're mad about the social issues that exist, the cultural issues that exist. They could care less about the budget deficits. Once you win there, you don't even have to go talk to anyone else. So that's part of the problem. But I don't think open primaries would fix this budget deficit by itself. I think the way to get to fixing a budget deficit is somebody has to pick up this gauntlet and talk about how right it is. That's something that I think Elon Musk, if he'd quit focusing on, when he decided to leave the Trump administration and then went onto these crazy attacks about, how he was part of the Epstein files and all of those types of things, which to me, I don't know if it's true or not, but my guess is it's just him being angry and trying to throw that into the fire to try to get even with him. If he sticks with the budget deficit and makes that a major theme of the party that he's creating, I think that they could actually have an effect on that issue, even if they weren't successful at getting candidates elected.
I agree that Musk is an interesting character on this particular issue. He has credibility on the issue. He worked on it in DC. He obviously cares about it enough to have broken with Trump over the deficit. My skepticism about a project led by Musk is that my reading of the third parties around the world that have sprung up recently is that they are grassroots movements, essentially. So if you look at the reform movement in Britain, the Reform Party, this is a extension of a long-standing Eurosceptic movement in Britain that was led by Farage for many years and had its biggest success at Brexit, which was a mass referendum with no, it was simply one person, one vote. You didn't have primaries. You didn't even have electoral constituencies. It was simply who got the most votes in the country. If you look at other grassroots movements, the Tea Party movement and the MAGA movement in the US are probably the most consequential outside of the mainstream political parties over the last sort of 15 years, and they were grassroots movements. I think that these third parties, if they're going to have staying power, if they're going to have success, seem to most recently have been driven from the bottom up by activists rather than from the top down by people like Musk. Now, if I was going to advise someone like Musk, I would tell him, therefore, to find a grassroots organization or some sort of grassroots network and try and support it. But of course, that's easier said than done. My skepticism about the top-down process is just that I don't see a real precedent for it at the moment. And most of the grassroots energy on the right, which is the natural constituency for a fiscally conservative type movement, most of the energy on the right is already encapsulated by the Trump movement. So maybe the best strategy is to try and capture the Trump movement for being more hawkish on fiscal deficits. But of course, that seems relatively unlikely at this point.
Yeah, the only thing I would say on that, Henry, in a little bit of a disagreement is I found it fascinating, the Tea Party movement in the United States. And I think there were benefits to the Tea Party movement in this way. around the country, almost at the exact same time. In Greece, they were striking because they didn't have enough days off, or they thought that their retirement accounts weren't high enough. And you had all these people in the Tea Party movement who were talking about the importance of not having a government that was too large. I thought that was beneficial. I didn't agree with the Tea Party on everything, but the idea that there was a counter force out on the streets saying our government's too big, I saw that as generally beneficial. I think there is a grassroots group of people out there who are extremely concerned about the budget deficit. And at some point, maybe it gets sparked again. But I do think that but a leader at a national level could have an impact on empowering them through creating a structure that might be helpful.
Yeah, I think that's true. And that would be my sort of take on this, would be that Musk's most likely success would be to take some sort of an organization that already exists and to spin it up using his resources and his expertise and technology, social media, etc., expertise, rather than trying to lead this as a top-down sort of movement. I think that the bottom-up aspect is going to be the most challenging but also the most critical for any of these sorts of third-party or outside the mainstream type agendas.
Elliot, I'd like to ask you just a little different issue. We have seen Donald Trump position on tariffs, and here today, maybe it was yesterday, he talked about increasing tariffs on the EU and on Canada, which, it almost gets lost anymore. He's taken them up and down and gone backwards and forwards so many times. You don't really even know if the guy's serious, if the taco thing is true, or if he is serious. Either way, it stopped becoming the big news that it once was. What I'm interested in is the idea of whether or not you could have a third party that began to look at things like growth and lowering costs. To me, there are some significant issues that exist in the United States in terms of lowering costs. We see it in housing. And the Democratic Party has been a much bigger violator of this than the Republican Party. They add costs on by adding regulations, rules, time, increasing the cost that go down to the lower consumer, making it much more difficult to get things built. To me, tariffs are very similar. It's a cost issue. You're talking about the cost that you're passing on to the middle class. But this transforms into a variety of different issues, energy issues, the amount of regulations and rules and taxation that we've put on this, on our product, the overhang that exists from it, I think is incredibly problematic. And I guess my question to you is, would you see it as being attractive if you had a third party that was really focused on that concept, on lowering cost, lowering regulations, and trying to expand growth?
I think that you need a third party that is very focused on a few issues that are easily explainable, and that the more issues they tackle and the more esoteric those issues, the bigger the problem. I still remember watching Perot on TV with all those charts. He'd get this goofy guy who's a billionaire from Texas trying to explain to the American people what this means. And he did it. They got something like, 18% of the vote? Enough to really shake up both parties. I think unless it's, as you said, it's hijacked from the inside, as Henry put it, you're going to have to settle for moving the platform of both parties toward the center based on people saying we need this concept. So I would hope that any third party limits the scope of things they talk about.
Bob, politically, would you agree with that? Would you see the idea of trying to talk about more of a free market economy as being too much of a lift? Meaning, should we just stick, if a third party was formed, should it just stick to the budget deficit, stick to the idea of including independence? How would you see that in terms of what would be the best way to give lift to a third party?
I think it gets back to your question as to whether the purpose of a third party is to influence events by changing the contours of the two dominant parties, or is the purpose to become a true governing alternative, a organization that seeks to win elections and govern? If it's the former, then I think Elliot is right. You need to have a laser focus on the issue that you think is being neglected in the public debate and concentrate on that. And the budget deficit and the impending fiscal challenge that we are sleepwalking our way towards, I think, is the prime candidate for that. On the other hand, I believe there is a broad hunger in the American electorate for competent, pragmatic, problem-solving leadership in the political realm. And I think that goes across a wide variety of issues. And one of them is the one that you mentioned. We have tied ourselves in knots in building and producing things. And you even have within the Democratic Party, in the abundance movement, a recognition that something needs to be done about that. But the environmentalists control the Democratic Party, and it's not going to get done through the Democratic Party. So I think you could combine the budget deficit, reducing the barriers to economic progress and productivity, and reforming the social welfare state. So it's less costly, but more effective for those who have to take advantage of it. All those are things that can be accomplished. You've got ideas about how to do all of that stuff. And I think you also would then add to that a more civil politics. People are sick of the spitting and the fighting occurring from both sides. So I think I think that you would have the possibility of a viable third party that would compete for governing on the basis of providing competent, pragmatic, problem-solving leadership for the country.
All right. So counter to that, Henry, I will ask you this question. So I'm appalled by things I see going on in the Republican Party today, and it just seems to me like the era of Ronald Reagan is gone. I mean, there's nothing like the Ronald Reagan Party that we once knew. And just when I get upset about the things that they're doing on tariffs and the budget deficit, the Democratic Party elects somebody like Zohran Mamdani, who is a part of the Democratic Socialist Party, who that advocate for things like taking over the means of production, globalizing the infantata. They have talked about rent controls, just about every socialist program you could possibly imagine. And I get done listening to that, and my fear is this: I don't think he's an outlier. I think he is the trend. I think AOC, the squad, Mamdani, I think that's the trend of the Democratic Party. That is the response to Trumpism. I'd love to have kind of your thoughts on that, and whether or not this idea that Bob is talking about, which is trying to create a government that's more focused, or a party that's more focused on how do we build things? How do we get things done? How do we provide for pragmatic solutions? Is that a worthwhile endeavor where we're talking about creating an actual governing party that may actually be able to help on that? Or should we just be trying to influence the debate?
Well, there's a lot going on there, Paul. Let me make first, I'll try and go through things one by one. I really like what Bob has said before and just said about what I would call governance, right? Being able to run things, whether it's a city or a state or a federal government. I think it's absolutely critical. People should be more attuned to how difficult it is, governance, and to how critical it is to their daily lives, right? But the thing about governance is it can only really be shown in demonstration. It's very difficult to go out and campaign on governance unless something is going very badly wrong and you can show how to fix it. Normally, you build a record of governance by being in office. So for a third party or for any sort of outsider, running on governance is going to be very, very difficult for a start. As important as I think it is, and as much as I wish that we had more people who did focus on it, especially at the local and state levels, right? So that's the governance thing. I think that's difficult for a third party. Mamdani, AOC and Bernie Sanders. I don't see them as the momentum or the direction of the party. I see them as the remnant. When a party has failed as spectacularly as the Democratic Party did in the elections last year, it discredits a lot of people, the candidates, their teams, their donors, their ideas. It discredits those people, even if they lose relatively narrowly, like Kamala Harris did. I mean, Kamala Harris actually had a shot at winning that election. Joe Biden had a shot at winning that election. They didn't. But they were not as comprehensively trounced as you might think, given how much criticism they and their whole approach has gotten. Now, when one part of the party is discredited, then people cast around looking for alternatives. And the reality is that the alternative to the mainstream Democratic Party approach as embodied by Harris and Biden, the alternative that still exists is Bernie Sanders and AOC and people like Mamdani. Not because they have any upward trajectory, but simply because they don't have a downward trajectory. Bernie Sanders and his ideas are still there. AOC and her ideas are still there. They haven't been tried and failed because no one tried to embrace them in practice anyway. Things like defund the police, things like free metro transit, government-run supermarkets and things. Bernie Sanders and AOC never actually tried to do any of those things. They just talked about those sorts of things. And so they remain. I don't think that that's the trajectory of the Democratic Party. I think that's the remnant. If after a failure, there's always a remnant. In this case, they are the remnant. Where the Democratic Party goes from there, I'm not sure. Now, something that a third party or an outsider could try and do would be to try and point that Democratic Party in a more productive direction. Of course, that's the debate that the party is having, and that debate is running the gamut from all sorts of different ideas, all sorts of people embodying those ideas. Some of those ideas around deregulation and things like that are things that we talk about here on the show that are normally associated with the Republican Party. So I think that there's a lot up for grabs in the Democratic Party at the moment. I wouldn't rule out an outsider of some kind coming in with ideas that are completely unexpected. But I think that the AOC Bernie Sanders is not the momentum. They're the remnant at the moment in the Democratic Party.
Elliot, I've been watching you for a long time, and if I were describing you to someone, I would have said you were an independent that leaned towards kind of the Reagan Republican Party. The Republican Party has drifted away from you further and further, but that's completely offset by the fact the Democratic Party terrifies you. You're in New York right now. You're listening to kind of the things that's going on with the potential of this new mayor being elected. Not only what is your view, but what are you hearing from other people that were there as well? And I don't know if you're in New York today, but I believe you were.
Yeah, but I was in New York during the election. First, let me give you some background on me, so all your Democratic voters can turn this off. Until Reagan, I was a registered libertarian for about 20 years. I am a great believer in the less government you have, the better off you're going to be. And the more decisions are made by the individual rather than government, the more free you're going to be. Reagan, I liked because he had a point of view. You knew exactly where he was going. He was very blunt about it, and he went in that direction. The fact that he won World War III without firing a shot was just a bonus, as far as I was concerned, relative to the other things he did. And I think that today, I'm not sure he would have won because the younger generation of Americans and the younger generations who voted for Mamdani are trying things that have been, as we talked about before the show started, have been tried things that have been tried thousands of times throughout history and have failed thousands of times throughout history. But they want to do it again because it sounds good. It's free stuff. And it's not your responsibility. It's the government's responsibility. And that's what I saw in New York. The people who voted for him were very much of the camp This is the government's responsibility. My life is not mine. It's the government's. And I find that, I find that terrifying.
All right. So, Bob, I want to go back into political history a little bit here because I think that that's interesting to think about what we're going to do. Henry had talked about this, the AOCs and the squad being a remnant, not necessarily the pattern or where we're going to be going. And that's an interesting concept. But I think back to to watching politics over the last 30 or 40 years. You go back to the era where Johnson left office. Nixon ends up winning by beating Humphrey. He wins by beating somebody who was much more liberal, certainly, than Lyndon Johnson was. You then move all the way forward to him being impeached. After he's impeached and Gerald Ford comes in, there's this reform effort, and this young peanut farmer ends up winning, who kind of is more conservative. But after he ends up winning, it goes back left. It goes back left with Walter Mondale. It goes back left with Dukakis. After significant losses in both of those races, you end up having, after 8 years of one of the more popular presidents, Ronald Reagan, or at least you can't argue that he had more votes in the Electoral College than any other president since then. I think he got all but one state by the time he was done. But nonetheless, this guy named Bill Clinton is able to overcome that. Now, he had created what was called the Democratic Leadership Council. And by the way, I will say in that particular race, I was actively engaged with a guy named Paul Tsongas, who was even more conservative on economic issues than Bill Clinton was. And that was kind of our force for it, or the thing that we were fighting about. But nonetheless, Bill Clinton, when he ended up being successful at becoming president, it was partly because of the Democratic Leadership Council, which was a conservative group within the Democratic Party looking for answers to problems that Democrats were pointing out, but trying to provide a more, I'm going to call it conservative, but at least mainstream answer than was being provided by the far left. That council, I believe it was 2011, they discontinued. I don't see any force in the Democratic Party that's going to be able to take on that far left wing base. And I'd like to say it's the progressives, but I actually think it's the socialists. I think that I've given up hope on the Democratic Party. I'm listening to these folks at worst defending Mamdani, and then at best saying, well, he needs to define what his positions are. And my answer is, no, you don't need to define what the positions are. I can go read it. I can open up the platform of the Democratic Socialist Party, and I can figure out what it is that they agree with. And it's way, way off of anything that's made us successful. And in all candor, it terrifies me more than the Trump side terrifies me. I'd love to have your thoughts on, is this a remnant, or is this actually a pattern in the Democratic Party? Or is it something they can get over?
I think it's worth remembering that prior to the 2020 election, Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden developed a unity platform that Sanders approved, and Biden largely implemented. So I think that Biden is still thought of as more center-left than he actually governed, and he governed far left. So I think that Sanders had a large influence on the Biden agenda, and helped shepherd a lot of it through Congress. Now, I believe that with the debacle of the 2024 election, that what the Democratic Party stands for is up for grabs, and will be the focus of the 2028 presidential primary on the Democratic side. And while it's true, you do not see the same organization for sort of a center-left perspective. Center-left candidates have won. I mean, in Arizona, I think Mark Kelly could be accurately described as center left. I think Greg Stanton could be described as center left. And if you go back to 4 years before Bill Clinton won the Democratic nomination, the influence of the organization that you cited was nowhere to be seen when Dukakis was the candidate. So we are kind of at that post-Dukakis point in the Democratic Party today. And I think you will see an attempt by the center left to develop that kind of infrastructure to support center left, the prospects for center left nominees in 2028, and not cede the nomination to someone in the Sanders AOC camp. I think there will be a full-throated debate over what the Democratic Party stands for during that primary.
So, Bob, if that's correct, then here's my question for you. Let's go back to this third party. I find, again, this to be an interesting discussion topic, which is, should we be more focused on a third party of simply trying to influence the two parties, or should we be more actively engaged at trying to become a mainstream party? And it seems to me you could do both, meaning you could truly attempt to try to become a mainstream party that is competitive. But if you're able to dramatically influence either the Republican Party or the Democratic Party back to the center, the fact that you're absorbed into them isn't necessarily a bad thing. We look back at Ross Perot, which we spoke about a moment ago. The Bull Moose Party did the same thing. The Bull Moose Party ended up with the election of Woodrow Wilson. And what it did was it took this Republican Party that had been in control for a very long time. He had what he called progressive ideas. You wouldn't even know the word progressive in terms of today's standard. But in his day, it was about trying to make certain that, we didn't develop the Grand Canyon, and that you had some wilderness area that was being protected, and that you had open space that mattered, and that labor had some voice in the system. And you didn't, every time a corporation decided that they didn't like labor, you send out the police or the National Guard to try to stop the labor side. He was trying to come about with some type of balance. He was successful. He was just successful by electing Woodrow Wilson. And that's effectively what he did. And so I look at this and say, if a third party is going to start, and there is going to be a third party, I can promise you that that's going to happen. What I can't promise you is whether or not it's going to have a short-term window or a longer-term window. It seems to me in this discussion, there might be an advantage to focusing on the long term, just recognizing that may not be the goal. Your thoughts, Bob?
Well, I think Musk is so politically toxic that the best that can be hoped from a third party that he is financing is to put on the public agenda a neglected issue that both parties are trying to skirt around, and the deficit is that. But we also had, before the 2024 election, another attempted third party effort in No Labels. And No Labels was looking to match proven, competent politicians from the center left and the center right as an alternative. It ended up not fielding a candidate. But getting to Henry's point about a third party not being able to demonstrate governance, that's true if it's all new figures. But let's assume that you had a third party whose nominees were people like Michael Bloomberg and Jeb Bush, with a track record of competent, pragmatic, problem-solving leadership. Well, then you're talking about something entirely different. But I think Musk is too politically toxic to attract those kind of people. So I think if it's a Musk initiative, what it can accomplish is limited and should be sharply focused. But I do believe that there are the building blocks of a viable third party that will compete for governance. If you can begin to get center-left and center-right candidates to abandon hope of a future for their particular perspective in the Democratic or the Republican Party. And I think that we march closer to the day where those kind of major known defections might be a possibility. But I don't think it's a possibility with a Musk-led or financed effort.
So, Elliot, I'm going to bring this question to you as well. But what Bob is talking about that I find to be interesting is that there really are at least 3 party efforts that are going on, not counting the one that's already on the ballot, which was a party that you were a member of, the Libertarian Party. You have Musk's American Party. You have the No Labels Party. The No Labels Party, that's a great group of people nationally. They did make an attempt to try to put a person on the ballot. My read, I don't really know the internal politics of what happened. My read was there was a lot of political pressure to not field that candidate because it would have hurt Kamala. My answer to them would have been, sooner or later, you're going to have to hurt somebody. The answer is, if you run a candidate, you begin creating a pathway. And then after you create that pathway, the next candidate may actually do better. Maybe it's not so important that you win the first election. But then you have the Forward Party with Andrew Yang that's come about, and they're actually working the opposite end. They're starting to work at the local level, trying to get candidates who will run so that they can change the open primary debate. I look at the 3 of these and think there's a great common cause of interest that maybe our Elon Musk could focus on the idea of one issue in the American Party, and that would have an overlapping effect on the other 2 parties who might be more local. Your thoughts on that?
I'm not optimistic about that. First of all, the Libertarian Party has been running candidates for decades. And they don't get anywhere because they're far too dogmatic. And they will never be a factor in American elections, in my opinion. And which is why I quit them, because they just, as much as I talked to them about this, they wouldn't get away from the dogma. And no dogma is completely perfect, certainly not libertarian dogma. But I think that if you want to have an effect, you can't have 3 parties. You've got to narrow it down to one where people will focus on it. And that if you have 3 parties, all you've done is create the spread between people. And will one of them actually be strong enough so that people notice the effect they're going to have on the election, and maybe move their platform after they win or lose the next election to take into account what they saw the American public saying. I'm not sure, and Henry and Bob are much better at this than I am, if America will ever have a European-style government where there's lots of political parties. I don't. That would be a shift that's almost unthinkable, and because we've been brought up that it's a 2-party system. You don't have to make the concessions, for example, that the Israelis have to make to have a government, or even the British used to have to make to have a government, and so it's just too far-fetched for me. I think the best we can hope for is what Teddy Roosevelt tried to do, although he had the best chance of winning of anybody, and he couldn't do it, or what Perot tried to do and actually did, and that is affect the platforms of both parties and the thinking of both parties going forward. So a free-for-all with a lot of parties, I think we're wasting our time.
So, Henry, this idea of a free-for-all, I agree with Elliot on that. The concept of having 3 parties in a space that already is somewhat narrow, that seems to be a challenge. But when I look at this, my view is I remember when I was growing up, there was like Pepsi and Coke, and then came the Un-Cola. It wasn't like cola. To me, there's room for what I call an unparty, something that's post-partisan, that looks at this from a very different point of view. So one way to look at a political party is you go create a platform, you create an orthodoxy. After you get your orthodoxy, you talk about the importance of having conformity, which was what the Libertarian Party was trying to do. And if people don't conform to the agenda, you don't want them on. Well, I look at this, and I look at what Bob was talking about earlier, which is creating some type of pragmatic solutions. In that, you could say, no, we're not going to have an orthodoxy. We may have one or two issues like the budget deficit that is at the top of the level, but we're interested in your creative ways of trying to solve these problems that exist. And we're looking for a group of people who aren't running to talk about how bad the other candidates are, but instead to talk about the ideas that you want to support. And in fact, we could have a party that said, we may endorse a Democrat or a Republican who's running instead of somebody who runs in our primary, because we think that they're more inclined to being able to do that. And at that point, the American party could potentially say, well, we're still going to be a national party, but we're going to endorse what maybe this local effort's doing, which might be a coalition of interests of both the No Labels Party and the Forward Party. My point here is that I can see a way in which, if you don't focus on orthodoxy and platform and having a detailed list of the guidelines that people have to live within, that you can create something that is much more enjoining to this new independent group of people that we have today, which, by the way, some are on the far right, some are on the far left, some are on the center right, some are on the center left.
From what I've observed, most of these movements are best described as movements, not parties. So in a way, it resonates with what you say in that they have a goal, they have something they want to achieve, but they are pragmatic about how they do so. So, for example, Nigel Farage has led now at least 3 different political parties, but when you say, what does he want? It's absolutely clear. He's always wanted Britain out of the European Union, and he has dedicated his life to that, right? And about half or 60% of the British public agreed with him on that issue, whereas the political parties, the main political parties, weren't giving them that space. So you've got this goal that's consistent. You've got the mainstream political parties that are not offering that goal or credible policy on that issue, and you've got this mass support. And the way that Farage mobilized around that issue was really very different from time to time. For a long time, he was actually a member of the European Parliament, of all things, because it gave him the biggest platform to rail against the European Union, ironically. And if you look at Germany, the alternative for Germany, they started out as wanting to get Germany out of the European currency. That was what got them their initial motivation. The party was later taken over by anti-immigration, anti-Islamic people, but they had a clear goal at the start, and how they organized was very variable. I would even say that Macron's party in France, the name of which I can't actually recall because it doesn't really matter, it also had a very clear mission, which was to elect Emmanuel Macron and elect a parliamentary majority for him to do what he wanted to do. You could say in a way that the Republican Party at the moment has also got a very clear goal, which is to elect Donald Trump and give him a majority in Congress to do what he wants to do. So if you can define a single issue that people really care passionately about, that other political parties are not giving them what they want, and you can stay clearly devoted to that issue, you can be pragmatic about whether you pursue that issue at the local level, at the state level, at the national level, whether you pursue it by running candidates in the Democratic primary or the Republican primary as independents, whether you pursue, for example, in Arizona, you can pursue ballot initiatives, right? But if you have that clear goal, that basically is the foundation on which everything else is built.
There's, to me, in a third party, there is so much room for a third political party to operate within, that the biggest challenge is trying to identify what that single issue is. And certainly the deficit is at the top. But I mean, you can look at so many issues like freedom of speech. Okay, well, freedom of speech on the Democratic Party has been harmed dramatically by kind of wokeism and by cancel culture and those types of things. And so then you can go back to the Republican Party and say, well, let's see, They want to deport Elon Musk now because he's not supportive of Donald Trump. That kind of sounds similar to me. It sounds
Well,
like
Paul, he may also have overstayed his student visa and thereby broken the law. I'm just saying, we don't know, okay? We don't know.
But you can watch this over and over again on the issue of regulations. The Democratic Party is so far off base on regulations, and they're not really paying attention to the idea that they're adding huge costs to the middle class, to the price of a home, to the price of goods, to the price of products. And then you get Donald Trump, who comes up with this tariff concept that talks about how we can add even more costs on top of that. There's so much room for a third party on so many issues, more than I've ever seen. I mean, when Ronald Reagan was running against Walter Mondale, to me, that was a choice, right? You really were choosing between two very different sets of ideas. I'm watching these two parties, and in many ways, I think they're becoming increasingly more similar. Somebody said on one of the podcasts the other day that you have to choose between the Democratic socialism or Republican nationalism. By the way, he was saying it as if we ought to all be excited about supporting Republican nationalism, and that we need to just get on board, and that's the thing that we need to do. This was David Sachs's concept. And the answer is, no, those aren't the only two choices. That's just not true. There are other choices. It's just that the two parties aren't offering them. I think there's a huge amount of ground, but I think that huge amount of ground is the problem for the political parties because there's so many choices in terms of where it goes.
Right. In a way, Paul, if it was so simple, the issue was glaring and staring us in the face, then we wouldn't be having this conversation because some political entrepreneur out there would already be running for the Democratic primary on exactly that issue, right? It's like Trump with the immigration issue. If I'd said to you in 2014, a complete political outsider is going to run his whole campaign on immigration and win the Republican primary and the presidency, you would have said that's crazy. That's not the top of people's priorities at the moment. And yet it was. And it takes a certain person from outside the establishment who can tap into some deep felt sentiment that's not being addressed by the parties. And that's not as simple as it sounds. There are a lot of people out there devoting their entire lives and careers to finding that issue right now. And if it was so simple to find, then we wouldn't be having this conversation.
So, Bob, your thought in terms of forming a political party, you made mention of the idea that that you like the idea of focusing on pragmatic solutions and how it is that we can solve some of these problems. But one of the challenges is going to be there are three political parties. All right. So, Bob, you made mention of the idea that it would be good to have an actual group or a party that would focus on pragmatic solutions. You also spoke about the idea that Elon Musk may be too volatile, and I don't think there's any challenge to that. He is a volatile human being, and I'll bet you there are a whole lot of people who've invested in his companies that just wish he'd go back and focus on building some of the great products that he's been building. But nonetheless, there are going to be three forces in this marketplace, at least three. What do you think the key is to being successful on that? And do you see that as, two groups ought to pull out or that they need to find a way to cooperate? How do you see that challenge existing? And I guess the point here is there's a trend that's happening. There is a big, huge space that's been left open with the two political parties occupying increasingly a narrower and narrower space within the public sphere. And that's creating a huge opening for third-party groups to get engaged. How do you see, or what do you see as being the keys for a third party to be successful?
Well, I'm not persuaded that Musk is going to go forward with all that he has vowed. I would look at the Republican Party and how it voted on the budget reconciliation bill as an indication that at least they aren't taking Musk's threat seriously. He threatened primaries against any Republican who voted for the budget reconciliation bill, and only 3 Republicans in the entire Congress voted against it. So they obviously do not regard him as a political threat to them. And he has a short attention span. And I'm not sure that he's going to pursue what he has vowed. I think a more serious foundation was what was started with the no labels movement. And it was initially a movement. It became a political party in certain states, including Arizona. And those were serious political figures. Joe Lieberman was one of the founders and leaders of it, of people who thought that there wasn't a space for pragmatic problem solvers of the center left or the center right. As I said, I believe that there is a broad hunger for that kind of leadership. I don't know whether there's the organizational will or skill to form a third party that would capture that and actually compete for the ability to govern and attract candidates that have a proven track record, so you don't have the problem that Henry mentioned of making a claim that you had no ability to verify or make credible to the electorate. I think the best you can hope for Musk, if he does follow through, is, as we've discussed, elevating to the appropriate space on the political agenda the issue of the rotten finances of the federal government and the need to do something about it. But I believe independent of that, I think you had the beginnings of it with the no labels movement. You have people who are experienced at politics, who are dissatisfied with people of their own belief being thwarted and not really having a path to the general election ballot, or not happy with the state of our unproductive politics and wanting something better for the country. You, Paul, would know better than me what remains of the no labels movement, whether that structure remains in place and viable, or whether people of a similar mindset would need to reorganize and begin afresh. But I do believe that the political marketplace is there. The question is, do the right people have the organizational will and skill to satisfy what I believe is a broad-based political hunger for a different type of political leadership for the country and for the state and for many cities in this country.
So, Bob, what I will tell you is there's going to be, in Arizona, there will be a third party on the ballot. I don't know if it will end up being the remnant of the No Labels Party or a new one that comes about. There is a broad group of interest from a number of people who are just simply not satisfied with the existing system. So here's what I will ask as my last question. And I want you to give me a personal answer on this one. So if you were to have a third party that was local as opposed to a national one, opposed to having a presidential party, what would be the factors inside that party that would make it attractive to you? Would it have a more detailed agenda, or would it have kind of a broad guideline trying to make certain that people are supportive of the rule of law and free markets? Would it be more focused on people who were technically adept at being able to solve big problems, or would it have superstars on it that you kind of knew the names of the people that were there? What are the factors when you look at a party that would make you attractive, that would be attractive enough for you to end up taking part in it if it were to happen at the state level?
Yeah, it's pretty simple. This is you talk about the marketplace. This is the marketplace of ideas, and you don't know until you present all the ideas in certain forms which ones the public is going to spend its money on. They're going to vote for, and so I can't give you an answer. It's going to have to be somebody who's clean, who has credibility, who's not known as either far left or far right, and he's going to have an issue or two that most people agree with. And so it's completely different than the existing structure of the Republican and Democratic Party. And what's going to work? Again, it's the marketplace of ideas. I have no idea. The structure I just gave you is, I think, what it would take. And I would not in any way, shape, or form try to emulate one of the other political parties.
All right, Henry, if you were going to be attracted to this new political party, what would be the elements or characteristics of it?
I think I'd return to some of the things I said before. A single individual with a single overarching goal that is new and not being served in the way that other parties are serving it. But similarly to Elliot, what that goal would be, it's really super hard to predict. I think that these things require a certain amount of entrepreneurialism, right? This is kind of returning to Joseph Schumpeter's theory of the entrepreneur. They do things that had previously not been conceived. They add value by doing things that other people hadn't even thought of. And so if someone could come at the state or local level and articulate a vision for how to make, for example, the greater Phoenix area or the state of Arizona the best place to live in America or the world, right? Some sort of amazing ambition. And that person had a reputation and a character that you really felt you could get behind. I think that people would be interested. But what exactly that idea is going to be, who exactly that person is going to be, is always impossible to predict. The same way it was impossible to predict that the iPhone would be invented, that Teslas would become a popular car. All these things that represent these huge leaps, they're impossible to predict.
Well, Bob, I'm going to give you last comment on this, and I'll just ask this now a little different. Same concept. I'm interested in what are the characteristics, but do you see that as being one person or a group of people that would be important to you if there were a local party that was being promoted?
In an election, a single individual would be sufficient to attract my vote compared to what the two parties are likely to put up. In order for it to be a party that I would think of joining, it would need to be broader than that. And you would need to have some kind of confidence that institutionally it was going to continue to produce candidates that would offer an alternative. I'm a traditional Reagan, Bill Buckley conservative with strong libertarian leanings like Elliot. And I feel as though I've been abandoned by the Republican Party. I became an independent once I became convinced that, and this is before January 6th, once I became convinced that Trump was engaged in an attempted coup to remain in office despite losing an election. And that most of the Republican officials and elected officials in Arizona were either part of that effort or condoned it. And so I became an independent. At this point, and I would be attracted even by someone from the center left with whom I disagreed substantially on a variety of issues. If they offered that pragmatic problem-solving competence that I am among what I think is a broad section of the electorate that are hungry for. When you have the danger of Trumpism and his unwillingness to be constrained by our constitutional order, and you've got the threat of wokeism on the left, which attacks the idea of America being a ever-evolving meritocracy and wants to assign benefits based upon personal identification factors. I would support anyone who didn't fall in either of those camps individually and might support a political party that looked like it had some legs to offer something other than wokeism or Trump nationalism on an ongoing basis.
Bob, I'm just going to say to that as a closing to this. I have many, many Democratic friends who are terrified of Donald Trump, people who I've known and cared about for a long time. They cannot see that this concept of globalizing the infantada, the wokeism on the far left, the amount of regulations that are there, that there are a broad spectrum of people who are on the center left who find that as distasteful as anything going on the far right. And it, my warning to both political parties is, Elliot had talked about the marketplace of ideas. You're creating a great marketplace for a new set of concepts. And if you don't do something, if you don't find a way to tack to that center, to find a way to get that common ground, you're going to not only have competition, but you may go the way of the dinosaur. What you just said, Bob, was that you'd be willing to buy into somebody on the center left. But I don't think that the left thinks the center left is where you think the center left is. And I think the same thing is true about the center right. The center right it's not where I think it is. We have a challenge. This is just a big challenge. And the existing political system is way underserving the United States of America. If you look at how well we're doing in so many ways in our economy and our ability to produce goods, our ability to improve human progress more than anyone else has before, our political system is just way underserving that, and it shouldn't be that way. But it's that way because their only goal right now is to go figure out how to win their partisan primary by appealing to the far, far left or the far, far right, and then hope that they can convince the rest of us that the other side's worse. And that's not good enough. Something has to change. Gentlemen, thank you. It was a fun discussion. I appreciate all of your input and your thoughts, and I promise you a lot of it's going to go to more good than just our audience. I'm going to utilize some of these ideas as well. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
And we stand today on the edge of a new frontier, the frontier of unknown opportunities and perils. It holds out the promise of more sacrifice instead of more security. The new frontier is here.
You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness.